And here's the thing. What's the point of hodling? And what's the point of saving? And what's the point of working if by the time you hit your goal, you're dead? That's terrible. That's a bad idea, right? So the awesome part about Bitcoin is that not only, does it protect your purchasing power, but it also, once you adopt a Bitcoin standard, it allows you to think into the future. And that leads me to introducing the next panel, which I think is incredibly important, and I do think it's a convergence. Please, everybody, give a round of applause to the keynote, The Convergence of Bitcoin and Longevity by Marc.
Thanks. Hi, thank you. Yes, good evening, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you for the organizing team and the Plan B team. I was here as a guest for a few years, and when Plan B reached out to me to give a talk about the convergence of Bitcoin and longevity, I thought it's an interesting idea and concept. So let's see what I can tell you about. Maybe just very briefly from my side, I'm a tech entrepreneur since many years, got into Bitcoin in the earlier days, did a few projects in this field, and now since 5 years, I'm dedicating my time on longevity. And honestly, I see many of the very early Bitcoin people again in this new and exciting world. And I try to give you some of my personal thoughts about why Bitcoin and longevity has so many similarities. And maybe just to start, naturally, when you're in the early phase, and I guess some people in the audience might remember when they first interacted with Bitcoin, it was something new. For many people, it was something shady. It was something unserious, nothing to stay here. And similar to that, I think most serious researchers in aging, they really avoided, and sometimes still avoid, to use the term longevity, because very similar to Bitcoin in the early days, it's still something in, let's say, traditional science. It's regarded as something not scientifically based and founded. And this is changing as we speak. And that's why I think being an early Bitcoiner, the feeling you had back then of doing something on the other side is something which is happening as we speak in the longevity field. Something which is also quite interesting, and cryonics is not directly related to longevity, but it has a similar ethos behind. Hal Finley, which I don't think have to explain, after he unfortunately died, he cryoconserved his body. And nobody knows at this stage if this will ever work, but just the fact that maybe one of the most important individuals in this whole community, to a certain extent, believes in coming back, in what kind of personality, maybe gives you a certain indication what kind of mindset these people, which are the base of everything we're doing today in Bitcoin, is building the bridge to longevity and other futuristic topics. It's also interesting to see, and that's also out of my own experience, how many really very influential people are investing heavily, not only their time, but also their money into longevity. I had an overview of some of the names, but I don't show it because some of them are far away from the Bitcoin maxi world, so I don't want to generate any controversy. But as you can imagine, many of the wealthy crypto people are profoundly supporting, often for non-profit, some of these initiatives. There are no official numbers, but I know from some of the most relevant researchers and startups in the field that sometimes the majority of the funding comes from individuals who made their fortune out of Bitcoin. Another individual, I don't know who's familiar with Brian Johnson in the room. Yeah, a few, that's good to see. I mean, you can think about him what you want. He's maybe the most famous influencer in longevity. He spends a lot of money to optimize his own health span. And he also literally tries now to combine these two worlds of the halving, ultimately the final point in 2140, and his whole ambition to live till then. So it's just interesting to see how these different worlds are now coming together. And again, as you maybe also heard, also Tether, among others, is heavily investing in new topics. I mean, just today they announced these big projects in AI. They do a lot of things in biology and also in longevity. So it's fascinating to see how many of the biggest players in the whole Bitcoin and crypto space are now looking deeply into the longevity field. Then maybe just a few examples. There are many more. Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, he invested $3 billion to start a longevity company. It's the biggest seed funding ever. He fully financed it out of his own pocket, and he will invest up to 10 billion out of his own pocket in a company called Altos Lab. They do cellular reprogramming, very ambitious, definitely a moonshot, but as you can imagine, when you have a guy like Bezos, Yuri Milner is also involved, you can do quite a few exciting things. Similar to that, Sam Altman, ChatGPT, OpenAI, he is the main backer of a company called RetroBio. Founder was just in Switzerland for a conference I co-organized 2 weeks ago. And RetroBio just a few weeks ago announced a new breakthrough that they're able now to decode the molecular structure of the DNA 50 times faster than in the past, fully based on Sam Altman's main job, building AI. So there we see the convergence of two very exciting fields, pharmaceutical biology and AI. So again, quite interesting that maybe one of the most important individuals in AI also invests heavily in longevity. Then another individual, I guess everybody in the room knows, Brian Armstrong. He's CEO of Coinbase, a listed company. And on the side, and you can Google that, he's also the co-CEO of a longevity company called New Limit. They just did a funding round this week as well, where Eli Lilly, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, invested. And when Coinbase went public, as you can imagine, some of the shareholders said it's not acceptable that the CEO of a listed company is co-CEO of another company. But Brian Armstrong insisted to keep this mandate. So you can Google it. Besides Coinbase, he also has another role as a CEO for a longevity company. And then another quite interesting example is Calico, which was founded by Google already in 2014. They initially invested 500 million out of their moonshot division. So far, they invested 2.5 billion. The company never made any single dollar of profit, but Google also said they're willing to invest many more billion to literally, based on the knowledge as Google, be the first big corporate to generate breakthroughs, meaning also longevity drugs on a scale that can then also generate additional revenue streams. So these are just 3 examples. Also, funnily, I mean, it's public, but most people don't know about these examples. And that shows maybe a little bit how powerful people, mainly still focusing on their core business, are now also looking very seriously and with a lot of money into the longevity space. So that's why this analogy where we're standing in longevity, I guess, also has a lot of similarities when it comes to the whole longevity space. So if you maybe just have to break down what Bitcoin and longevity are tackling, I think if you think through, that might be the answer, right? Inflation, something which is unfortunately happening since we started our financial system. Sometimes it's happening faster, sometimes it's happening more or less obvious. But in human history, financial developments and also the rise of nations, to a certain extent, inflation was always one of the limiting factors, and I think we're now in a time frame where we see exactly these accelerated developments with, quite dramatic outcomes, I would say. And Bitcoin, maybe for the first time ever, based on math, tries to a certain extent now solve this issue, or at least it's a certain way to avoid the consequences. And now doing the jump to longevity, I think aging, if you look back in human history, there was always this ultimate dream, sometimes to live forever, or at least to live healthier and happier. But aging, at least that's the narrative, is given, right? You live, I mean, you get born, you grow up, you live, and then you die. And I think we're not talking about immortality, but I think the longevity research and movement has a very similar ethos than the Bitcoin community, that it challenges the idea that aging is just something because it happened in the last thousands of years since human existence, that it's something which can't be challenged and changed. So that's why this ethos, challenging the status quo, also maybe to a certain extent try to question the inevitable, is also a very common denominator. On the one side, maybe from the financial perspective, and from the other side, from the biological perspective, but I think it has a very similar mindset. Maybe just very briefly, because I know we're not at the longevity conference, I wanted to give you a very high level, and I'm not a scientist or a medical doctor, just a few insights about what aging really means, because for most people, as I said, aging is just a fact. But for the first time in human history, and that's happening as we speak, we will have far more elderly people than ever, with all the consequences. And naturally, the older you get, the higher the chances to get age-related diseases and living, unfortunately, in a very miserable state. So that's why the acceptance of aging, as we did in the past, is, in my view, no perspective, because ultimately it will generate a huge crisis and a lot of pain. And maybe similar to the idea of Bitcoin, I think it makes a lot of sense to dedicate time, money, and all the resources as a society to fight the traditional understanding of aging. And then just a few examples. I guess most of you are familiar with Ozempic, these new obesity drugs, right? They were literally hitting the market recently. Originally, the idea was helping overweight people to lose some kilograms, but as a side effect, as we also now all know, Ozempic and all the alike have very positive effects on the aging as well. And that's why maybe without really knowing it, Novo Nordisk created the first regulated drug which has a proven scientific-backed effect on aging. And just as a tiny side effect, and these are the latest numbers, we're talking about a huge market without already focusing on the core elements of aging. So that might give you a glimpse what's the market cap and the market size of drugs going forward, really focusing on aging, and why Google and other players are investing so much money without having any payback so far. And yeah, as I already said, I mean, the acceptance of aging, meaning that you just get older, you have less brain power, less physical strength, and then in the worst case, you have a few years of miserable life. I think that's something which will change and is already changing, and maybe also something which shouldn't be accepted. As a small example, the naked mole rat, not a very nice, but a very exciting animal, because most people also don't know this quite unique species doesn't really age. Naked mole rats, on average, they reach the age of 30 to 35 years, which is 6 times more than all the similar species which have similar conditions. They have literally no age-related diseases. They hardly get cancer. They normally just live 5 to 6 times longer than all the peers, and then at a certain stage they die. They don't lose their eyesight. They're not really losing muscle mass. So a very unique, specific, and so far unique element, which now leads to a lot of research, because what we know today is that these animals have very specific, very unique genetic elements which cause these unique aging elements, which means they're not aging as most other species do, meaning just by having this outlayer on our plate means that we have a lot of research now focusing on these interesting looking animal. And as I said, that's just a small example what's already happening without any changes in our activities. Then maybe also something, maybe similar to the whole Bitcoin Maxi discussion. When you talk about longevity, you have on the one side the immortalists. For them, it's about living forever, or at least for 1,000 years. And then on the other side, you have the ones who say, yeah, let's just do a little bit more sports and eat healthy, no alcohol, and then everything will be fine. I think ultimately the serious science is somewhere in between, right? I'm personally not an immortalist. I also think we will lose a lot of achievements or the sense and meaning of life if we would all live forever. But ultimately, maybe everybody has to decide if you would take the pill to live forever. But I think the serious longevity research there, it's really about extending the health span. And if we look at what we're standing right now, Switzerland average lifespan roughly 83 years. That's literally twice as long as 120 years ago. So everybody who says 110, 120 years of average lifespan is completely science fiction and unnatural. Unfortunately, then I have to say, I guess most people here in the room, 120 years ago, you would have already been dead. Because of all these medicine breakthroughs, we already doubled, at least in the Western world, we already doubled our life expectancy. And this will now accelerate. And biologically, if you think through, as soon as you can get pregnant, which is a few years before it normally happens in Western world, and you have kids and you grew them up and until they're independent, you're not used as a species anymore. So this idea that living for 100, 120 or 150 years is unnatural would also mean that everybody of us already lives in a quite unnatural state. So that gives you maybe a little bit of perspective what is happening and what already happened just in the last few decades. Then this is something maybe I don't go too much into detail because for me these are a little bit like the side use cases, because naturally everybody tries to somehow find blockchain and longevity related activities. I'm a little bit skeptical here. If you're interested in decentralized science, that's maybe something you can look into, how you democratize funding, but as I said, I think not something where you should put the main focus on. Yeah, and as I said in the beginning, I think ultimately the last Bitcoin halving in roughly 115 years from now is for quite a few people, I know a little bit their own time frame they want to reach to literally see the last halving happening. I don't know if this is too realistic depending on when you were born, but I think it's interesting to see how we have now a certain defined year where some people from these two worlds are focusing on. And additionally, what's also interesting that I was asked to give you a very high-level perspective at the Bitcoin conference, so I think that shows also a little bit the growing interest in this field. So as a bottom line, I mean, I think it's still important to understand that biology is not just code. I'm still fascinated to see when you look back in history just a few decades ago, how outdated many of the medicine and medical doctor protocols were, right? So as human species, we have to admit normally that we know that we don't know too much. And if you go a few hundred years back, when you look at all the things around church and the earth in the middle of the universe, and if you challenge that, you were literally killed. I think we have to admit that we don't know too much, even by living in a misperception that we already reached all the insights we can reach. And that's why what I also like about the whole longevity space, that it's ultimately biology. It's not marketing, it's not making money, it's the foundation behind this biology. And this is maybe something which also intrigued me to move into the space, because if it's not scientifically backed, it won't work. And that's why, again, as a bottom line, I think Bitcoin is and already did decentralized trust, and longevity maybe decentralized fate. And I think with that, for the ones interested, I was allowed to show some additional slides. If you're interested in the whole space, we publish weekly newsletters about business-relevant events and happenings in the longevity field. This is an event for investors in Davos we host during the World Economic Forum, because we also want to educate policymakers and politicians about longevity, so they understand that it's not by definition bad if people live longer, healthier and happier. It has a huge positive impact on society. And then this is a clinic we have in Zurich, a longevity clinic, fully regulated. So for the ones passing by Zurich when they move home or fly back home, you have a special goodie. And that was it from my side. And I see that I'm quite perfectly on time for the Q&A. So for the ones who still have some questions, go ahead. And thanks for listening. Yeah, let's see. One slide. Aha, okay. No question. Yeah.
I'm Italian loud. I don't think I need it. Hello.
I mean, I can hear. I don't know if the other ones can.
You said well, all the yeah, I don't know. You said Ozempic has proven side effect on aging, right? Are you referring to any particular study, or the skin or the effect on skin, which is not exactly aging, right? It's just a superficial effect on skin due to the weight loss.
No, it's really it's fascinating. I mean, you can also ask ChatGPT or Google it. It's really about aging. You have, for example, organ aging on average 5 years back, which is really astonishing. There was never any legal drug where you were able to rejuvenate literally the organs by 5 years. And liver, heart especially. So it's not just outside perception, it's really rejuvenating your body. And I mean, I have quite a few friends in longevity. They are completely in shape, and they take now Ozempic only for longevity reasons, which I wouldn't advise, but it's really fascinating, these side effects, and it's definitely age-related and not just the outside.
Hello. I've been a bit into the biohacking ecosystem. That's an intersection of the longevity, or let me say the hackish part, or the unregulated part. How do you see, in the longevity field, there's a lot of new discovery being published every day. Very challenging. The curve of discovery, it's going and growing very fast. But this is happening into the scientific sector. Then you have the clinical translation of those research to jump into the medical ecosystem. And this path from the research to the medical, in order to be acceptable by the conventional safety and efficacy methodologies to the modern law, will require decades of trials, because it's about longevity. So how do you see in this longevity sector, where we see a lot of pharma that are trying to tackle pathologies by tackling some underlying aging problem, but this problem of the translation from scientific research going very fast, and the time it adapted to become a medically available treatment?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's unfortunate, right? I mean, we have quite a few completely proven, for example, stem cell therapies which work, and you can go to Honduras, and if you have the money and the resources, you can do that today, and it will work. and you know that normal people, they have to wait at least 8 to 10 more years until these treatments are available. So this is not just longevity, but for all kind of treatments. So this whole approval process is extremely slow and especially extremely expensive. Maybe not too similar to financial industry, but I have to admit, knowing a little bit both worlds, the pharmaceutical regulation is by far worse and also far more lobbied by the existing incumbents than in banking. But ultimately, that's changing, right? I mean, you have now especially biohackers, they go to some other jurisdictions and do stuff which is not yet available. And what's interesting, a little bit similar to the early days of crypto, you have now regulatory frameworks, sandboxes, even in the US. For example, if you have terminal illness in the US since 2 years, you're allowed to do experimental treatments, but only if you're terminal ill. So that limits a little bit the number of potential candidates, but that's already a first start, right? So in the past, you really had to have the money and the resources to go further away. So that's why, coming back to your question, this regulatory arbitrage will accelerate because you have more and more biohackers, and they can scientifically prove that their crazy protocols seem to work, and not because they feel better and they have a big social media reach, but because they can prove and measure it, right? So, and that's why, similar to other industries, I think it will be interesting to see how the governments and the regulators react, because ultimately the regulators, by design, their main interest is to protect people, and as soon as you have treatments which would help people to better or optimize their health, there's ultimately no reason why you should stop or protect it if you wouldn't have a lot of money from lobbyists to somehow preserve the status quo.
Yeah, for me to measure my own health, I think it's very useful to use a Garmin. You see the resting heart rate, HRV, and do you implement that at your clinic and in your longevity view, and how you can research on yourself practically?
Yeah, I mean, I also have a smartwatch and some stuff, but I'm not a crazy biohacker, so I don't do all the things. So I'm also having a glass of wine quite regularly and everything. So don't take me as your role model, but naturally first to track it, to understand it, and also to see it. That's very important. I mean, especially, for example, with alcohol, every time you drank too much, you can literally see that it's not only a slightly hangover morning, but you literally, even the day after, you have different health metrics, right? So that's why having a Garmin or whatever kind of smart tracker and device to, for the first time, maybe realize what influences in which way your body and your health parameters is definitely a very important first step. And actually in the clinic, we go far more into all these kind of things, but for, let's say, non-biohackers, I think that's something which makes a lot of sense already today.
Yeah, most likely on the top of that. I check it all the time, but I have small children, so that ruins a lot. But for those that are pretty good at having their metrics high, what's usually lacking for them?
I mean, honestly, persistence. And what's a little bit unfortunate that everybody already knows how you can positively impact your life, right? Do some exercise, have enough sleep, eat healthy, avoid many things. But unfortunately, or maybe also luckily, because as I said, I'm not an extreme longevity ambassador, most people, they look for the shortcut. Then you go maybe to a clinic, you start with supplements, which makes a lot of sense for most people. But to really start implementing these behaviors in a consistent way, to then on the long run sustainably optimize your health, that's a little bit the challenge, because people are lazy and normally they don't want to change their behavior. All right, I think we're done. Perfect, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Have a nice day.